$1 trillion. In 2008, while the world watched banks collapse and families lose their homes, something else happened. Something they never told you about. Over $1 trillion simply vanished. Not stolen, not lost in bad trades, not evaporated in the housing crash. It disappeared through a mechanism so sophisticated, so carefully orchestrated, that even most bankers didn't know it was happening. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The people who discovered it were silenced. The documents were sealed. The investigation was shut down. And the banks? They walked away richer than ever, until a whistleblower broke their silence. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to show you the biggest financial cover-up of the 21st century. September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses. The financial world is in freefall. But inside the Federal Reserve of New York, something strange was happening. Meet Janet Tavakoli, a derivatives expert with 20 years on Wall Street. She'd worked for Goldman Sachs and had a reputation for spotting fraud before anyone else. In October 2008, Tavakoli was hired by a coalition of state pension funds to audit the financial crisis. They wanted to know, where did all the money go? What she found kept her awake for months. Tavakoli started tracking the money flows from the Federal Reserve's emergency lending programs. Between September 2008 and July 2010, the Fed loaned out approximately $16 trillion to stabilize the system. But when she cross-referenced the loans with the actual balance sheets of the banks receiving them, something didn't add up. The numbers were off. Way off. She discovered discrepancies totaling over $1 trillion. Money that went into the banks but never appeared in their official records. Money that was lent out but never accounted for in Fed audits. At first, she thought it was an accounting error. But then she noticed the pattern. The missing amounts weren't random. They were strategic. Specific subsidiaries, offshore accounts, shell corporations that existed for mere weeks before dissolving. This wasn't chaos. This was design. Tavakoli compiled a 300-page report documenting everything she'd found. She had transaction records, Federal Reserve wire transfers, and leaked internal bank memos. The evidence was irrefutable. She scheduled meetings with the SEC, the Department of Justice, and congressional oversight committees. But before she could present her findings, everything changed. November 2009, a cold Tuesday morning in New York. Tavakoli arrived at her office to find two men in dark suits waiting for her. They identified themselves as Treasury Department officials. They weren't there to listen to her findings. They were there to deliver a message. Ms. Tavakoli, one of them said, "You need to understand something. The financial system is fragile. What you're investigating could trigger another collapse if it becomes public. But here's what really happened behind closed doors. The missing $1 trillion wasn't lost. It was deliberately moved through a secret program approved at the highest levels of government and banking. During the 2008 crisis, certain banks were deemed too big to fail, but some were actually insolvent. If the public knew, it would destroy the entire system. So they created a solution, a shadow bailout program that operated outside the official TARP rescue. Here's how it worked. The Federal Reserve would loan money to Bank A at near zero interest. Bank A would immediately transfer that money to an offshore subsidiary not on the bank's balance sheet. That subsidiary would buy toxic assets from Bank A at inflated prices, moving the bad debt off the books. The subsidiary would then dissolve, writing off the losses, which were absorbed by the Federal Reserve. The result? Banks appeared healthy on paper while their toxic assets simply vanished. The cost? Over $1 trillion that disappeared from accountability. But Tavakoli had found the paper trail. She had the transfer records. She had emails from senior bank executives explicitly discussing the scheme. And that's when things got dangerous. 2 days after the Treasury officials visited her, Tavakoli's office was broken into. Nothing was stolen except her external hard drives containing copies of her research. Her phone started clicking during calls. Her emails were clearly being monitored. Then came the real pressure. The pension funds that had hired her suddenly withdrew their contract. She later learned they'd been threatened with federal audits and prosecution for interfering with national security interests. Tavakoli was alone, the most significant financial fraud in history, and she was the only one willing to talk about it. Or so she thought, because here's what the banks didn't count on. Tavakoli wasn't the only person who'd noticed. In 2011, Bernie Sanders, then a senator from Vermont, successfully pushed through an amendment requiring a one-time audit of the Federal Reserve's emergency lending. The results were released in July 2011, buried in a 266-page Government Accountability Office report that almost nobody read. But buried on page 131, there it was, a table showing $16 trillion in total loans, with a footnote indicating that certain transactions could not be fully reconciled due to accounting complexities. That footnote represented $1.2 trillion in transactions that the auditors couldn't fully trace. Tavakoli had been right. The report was published and then promptly forgotten. Mainstream media barely covered it. Journalists who tried to dig deeper were told by their editors that it was too complex for viewers to understand. But independent researchers started connecting dots. Here's what multiple investigations have since revealed. Evidence 1. Fed lending records show billions flowing to bank subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Ireland that had no actual business operations. Evidence 2. Former bank executives have testified in sealed depositions about pressure from Treasury officials to move assets offshore during the crisis. Evidence 3. A Bloomberg lawsuit forced the Fed to release transaction data in 2011, revealing thousands of loans to entities that couldn't be clearly identified. The most damning evidence? In 2012, the Financial Stability Board published a report showing that the total global derivatives exposure of major banks had somehow decreased by $1.1 trillion between 2008 and 2010. But nobody sold those derivatives. The market for them had frozen. They simply disappeared from the books. And Tavakoli, she published her findings independently in a book that was systematically blocked from major retailers and received almost no mainstream coverage. But the evidence remains. So where did $1 trillion actually go? After years of investigation, here's what we know. The trillion didn't evaporate. It was transferred. The question is, transferred to whom? Through bankruptcy filings, leaked documents, and offshore data leaks. Researchers have pieced together the answer. The money went to 3 places: bonuses and compensation. In 2009 and 2010, despite receiving massive bailouts, Wall Street paid out over $150 billion in bonuses. Where did that money come from? Offshore holdings. Between 2008 and 2012, assets held in offshore tax havens by major financial institutions increased by approximately $400 billion. Asset purchases. The remaining funds were used to quietly buy up distressed assets at basement prices, assets that would later generate hundreds of billions in profits during the recovery. In other words, the banks took public money meant to stabilize the system and used it to enrich themselves while millions of ordinary people lost everything. But here's the part that should make you angry. Nobody went to jail. Not one major bank executive was prosecuted. The Department of Justice settled with banks for fines that amounted to less than 5% of what they'd made from the scheme. And the system that allowed this? It's still in place. The same offshore mechanisms exist. The same lack of transparency continues. The same people who orchestrated this are still running major financial institutions. Janet Tavakoli is still trying to get congressional hearings. But the mainstream financial media ignores her because the truth is inconvenient. So what do we do with this information? Here are 3 things you need to understand right now. Demand transparency. Support politicians and regulators who push for complete financial transparency. No more offshore loopholes or shell games. Diversify your assets. Don't keep everything in traditional banks. The system that hid $1 trillion could do it again. Spread the word. The only reason they got away with this is because nobody was paying attention. Share this information. Make noise. The truth is simple. The 2008 financial crisis didn't just happen. It was managed. And in the process, $1 trillion was redirected away from accountability. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented fact buried in government reports, audit findings, and bankruptcy proceedings. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is, will we let them do it again? If this video made you angry, good. It should. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell, because this is just one piece of a much larger story. There are more financial scandals that need exposure. And share this video, because the more people who know, the harder it becomes to keep doing this in the shadows. See you in the next investigation.